That's quite a nice finishing comment there about design, because it links us right back to the start of our conference, where we had a presentation on design for safety and the role that design can play as being an international language for safety as well. Okay, so our next speaker is Andrew Curran, Professor Andrew Curran, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Health and Safety Executive. We've got the privilege of working with Andrew and his team across a number of projects now. But the one that we're going to be presenting today is a think piece. We're launching right now one of our new Foresight reviews, our Foresight review on the global safety evidence base. And this has been an ambition that we actually set out at the last conference. We told you about our 5-year plan, and the very first goal of our 5-year plan was to develop the evidence base to make better decisions on safety and better decisions on investing for safety. And the first part of that was a piece of due diligence, and we asked Andrew to chair that Foresight review, and he's going to tell us a bit more about the process and what he found and what he's come out with as well. I just wonder before Andrew comes off as well, I'd like to introduce Yasmin Crowther as well, who's the principal author of this piece of work, and I'm sure Andrew would also talk about this. But Yasmin's sitting over there in the front seat. Thank you, Andrew.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Ruth has said, this was my privilege to work on this Foresight review, and it's very important that Yasmin Crowther's role is acknowledged right at the very start. She was the person who did all the hard work, did all the interviews, spoke to lots of people from all around the world. What I don't want to do today is to spoil the story, because you need to read it for yourselves, but what I hope to be able to do is to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the thinking, some of the work that we did to try and unpick this complicated issue. But before I do that, I'd like to start with a bit of audience participation, so you can all start looking a bit nervous. The first question is, how many of you remember the pictures of the pelicans and the fish and the dolphins being contaminated with oil after the Deepwater Horizon event? Yep, a lot of people. How many of you remember seeing the newspaper headlines about the people who were sadly killed as a consequence of that event? Perhaps a slightly smaller number. How many of you saw the very same day the newspaper headlines saying that 105 people had died as a consequence of mesothelioma caused by exposures in their workplaces? Okay, nobody. Did anybody see it the day after? Or the day after? Or every single day until today? No. And I think that was the first point I wanted to make, that actually data is really important, but it can also be used in ways that don't necessarily give us the true picture of occupational health and safety. So this report hopefully starts to unpick some of those issues and take you on the same adventure that Yasmin and I went on when we started work on this really exciting and interesting topic. So it is now available, I think, Ruth, on the website. So it's got a lovely orange cover. And what I want to do today is just give you a brief overview, talk about the background, the approach, some of the findings and recommendations. So this is what we like to think about in the world of work. Richard Judge yesterday told you about our role as HSE in regulating that world of work. And of course, we've heard throughout all of the presentations over the last day and a bit about the amount of data that's collected from those different work organisations. But there is another picture of the world of work, and this is the one, unfortunately, that we tend to see. And these sets of data are perhaps less easy to collect, but we do actually collect them in a systematic way. So we've got lots of sets of small data, which we can hopefully compare to those large, big data sets to see if we can understand how we might predict accidents, how we might use an integrated approach to data analysis to enable us to better understand the precursor events that would lead to an adverse outcome. And one of the themes that came out of the work that we did was understanding some of the leading indicators for health and safety that will be of value to industry. and whether data would give us an insight into potential areas for exploitation of leading indicators as opposed to the lagging indicators that we all tend to use. So that was one theme. Why should we worry about health and safety? And what data is there out there that points us to this being a problem? And this is data from the ILO study of the global burden of occupational health and safety. And you can see that the numbers are staggering from a human life perspective. 380,000 fatal accidents, 2.4 million fatal occupational diseases, 373, nearly 374 million non-fatal occupational accidents. And of course, the tragedy is that if we had a better understanding of causation, all of these things are entirely preventable. That's a huge amount of life that could be saved if we had better insight into how best to address those issues. And that's before we even start thinking about the cost. And the estimate from the ILO is about 4% of total GDP is lost as a consequence of workplace ill health and accidents, which equates to $2.8 trillion every year. That's a huge financial and personal cost that is preventable if we're able to use the data in the right way. The other thing that's really important in the changing world of work, again, we've heard a lot about it over the last few days, is that the pace of change means that we have to be much more agile in how we use that data and how we gain access to that data in real time. So if you think about telephones, it took probably 30 or 40 years before telephones became common in every household around the world. Then think about TVs, probably took less time to do that. If you now think how quickly an app can be downloaded onto an iPhone and spread globally, it's a matter of days, weeks. So that pace of change means that we have to think differently about how we use the data to inform us about the best approach to improve health and safety performance. And pace of change was, again, one of those themes that came out of the conversations that we had. Health and safety leads to tragedy, and this it was a tragedy. It's the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. Over 1,200 people were sadly killed, 2,500 people severely injured in a clothing manufacturer. And obviously the links through the supply chain are really important. And I think in this particular disaster, there was an outcry that probably hadn't happened in the same way that it had happened before. Although the data was there, previous incidents that occurred all around the world leading to significant fatalities, this one caught the headlines. And I think sometimes you need to think about how data can be used to change opinions and change views. And this particular incident led to a program of activities, a 5-year accord in Bangladesh to improve inspection, to improve the training, to improve the leadership of those people who were running these kinds of organizations. And again, if we can get the right data in the right place at the right time, we can use it to make some big changes. And thinking about the Deepwater Horizon issue again, the environmentalists have worked very hard over a number of years to use data to change public opinion. And one of the challenges, I think, is how we can use appropriate data to change public opinion so that there is a movement to improve health and safety rather than just an ambition. I won't dwell on this too much, but obviously we are able to collect more and more data from more and more sources. We need to make sure that that data is appropriately managed ethically. So wearable devices. I was at a conference last week where some people were showing how they developed a wearable wristband to show exposure to PAHs in firemen. And the firemen were wearing these, and the data was collected and it was used to show their exposure. We're doing some work in Changi Airport at the moment, looking at wearable devices for workers on a construction site and monitoring their movement around it to make sure they don't ingress into any dangerous areas. But that's a lot of data that's being collected, and it relates to individuals and their personal information. So there's an ethical question about some of the data and how we manage that. We've already heard this morning about some of the backseat driver type issues, the automotive stuff. When we think about the future in relation to artificial intelligence, how will artificial intelligence draw down on some of the data sources that we've identified through the review, and how will it apply that to real-world health and safety problems? We already know that Microsoft is developing a process for hazard spotting using artificial intelligence. Dr. Watson has developed a health and safety management system that draws down HR information and creates a bespoke health and safety management system for individuals, which pulls data in from outside, which may not necessarily be validated. So people are already starting to do some of this stuff in a clever way. When Richard and I first had the conversation probably almost 2 years ago about this particular Foresight review, we started to frame the question in such a way that we could break down the various issues. And the first of those was to think about what data was available. The second was to think what that data might be used for and who would use it and what value they would gain from it. And the third was then how that data might be presented to them. And basically our program of activities followed that kind of schedule. There are huge amounts of data out there, and you can see some of them up here, from industry, from government, from non-government organisations. People have huge amounts of data about themselves, about their environment. Some of that is structured, some of it unstructured. There's a huge amount of research data. We collect information on failure, on why things fail. We do a forensic investigation looking at root causes, and our Discovering Safety programme with the Lloyd Register Foundation is now going to exploit that data in new and exciting ways. So lots of different data sources that we could tap into. What do those kind of things look like, and how might you use them? Well, I think for me, one of the great opportunities here to create value from the data is that we can learn from the past. We can systematically collect that information and use it to research the future, to provide a detailed analysis that enables us to provide simple, practical advice to organisations here and now. And it's a combination of knowledge generation and knowledge transfer that will ultimately deliver the best value from the data that is available. We as HSE have huge amounts of data. You'll have seen this in Richard's presentation, so I won't dwell on it. And here we're collecting data from individuals, from organisations, from our own data sources, and integrating that into ways that we hope will change views and opinions, because that is some of the power of data if you get it right. This is some really interesting data from the underwriters' laboratories, and I know they're represented in the room today. And they create this safety index, which looks at 187 countries. There's a scale here you can see from 0 to 100, where 100 is really good and 0 is not. And they draw data together from a vast range of sources, everything from the institutions that support health and safety, the safety system, the resources available, etc. And you can see that they have, from that integration of information, created a map of the world which shows where, from their perspective, the safe areas are. And you can see some unsurprising, perhaps, areas where the safety may be of concern. But that's just one way of integrating that data. And there are questions about the validity of the data, the nature of the data, the relevance of the data to the question that's being asked, and whether there are better ways that data could be drawn together to address bigger and more interesting questions. This is some work that Yasmin did with her company Polecat. This is just one slide, but the data represented here is from 8 million sources with 30 million data points over about a 4 or 5 month period. And it's essentially trying to see if we can capture some of the global conversation about health and safety using some simple indices, which you can see at the top there. This is just using English language to create this global safety scorecard. And it was an experiment, and what it showed was that there's a lot of conversation going on about health and safety, and in lots of different areas. So if I can find the laser pointer, which isn't working, but never mind, I'll use the old-fashioned laser pointer. You can see, if we take the first one, safety in general, that there's a range of conversations going on about health and safety in different sectors. And what the data was able to show, again, this was an experiment, so it's very early stages, is that you can identify some activities that cause the conversation to change. And then you can see that in real time as you're monitoring this information over time. And of course, then you start to ask the question, well, if we're doing this on a regular basis, could we identify precursor events that would enable us to intervene earlier than we would otherwise? An example might be, for example, a big issue in the UK last year was fairground rides. And could we have seen issues in the conversations around some of those fairground rides where perhaps the rides were failing or they were reporting issues that might have popped up in this sort of conversation type unstructured data model? So early days for this, but I think there's some really exciting opportunities as to how this data might be used and this might be developed to give us some real-time information about where health and safety is going. Foresight's really important. I just mentioned our foresight report and thinking about what we need for the future world of work. We do that through a simple, I hate to use the word strategy now, but it is actually, I think, in line with what Adam was saying this morning, in that we think about the future. We therefore can identify the knowledge gaps and create the evidence to support effective control of the risk, demonstrate that that provides protection to workers, which feeds into our policy and operational activities, and ultimately catalyses the whole system to do something about it. It's not just our job as HSE, it's everybody's job in this room to do something about it. So making the data available to the system therefore becomes really important. What issues did we find? I've already talked about the leading and lagging indicators. This one is really important, and I think the surprising thing for me was that of all the conversations that Yasmin had around the world with different organisations and different bodies, health came out as something that people wanted to talk about and wanted to engage on. And I think there's an interesting challenge for the Lloyd's Register and the Lloyd's Register Foundation here in their own thinking of what health is, because from my perspective, if you think about a safety issue and a health issue, should we be thinking about it as two separate nouns or should we be thinking about it as a compound noun? I think for me, actually, it is a compound noun, and this work that Yasmin and I have done has sort of reinforced that view, because for me, if you think about the approach we take to risk assessment, we tend to do it on a population basis. But if you think about yourself, the way that you approach work and your day at work varies depending on how you're feeling. That might be your mental health, your physical health. And therefore, if the control of risk is predicated on a population-based solution and we don't reflect the individual variability on a day-to-day basis that you might feel when you are, if you like, using those control measures, we forget that that may result in an adverse safety outcome. So health status can lead to a safety consequence. And if you therefore don't think about health, you miss the opportunity to intervene and improve the safety outcome. Similarly, safety outcomes often lead to health consequences. So the asbestos story at the start was because people were not controlling exposure to asbestos. That's a safety issue. The intervention is a safety intervention. So if you forget about health, you might forget about the people. And the people are probably the most important part of the system that we need to understand and manage. Data quality is obviously an issue. That came out this morning. How we reach the right parts of the system through business, how we make sure we're collecting the right kind of data through new technologies, and how we provide that information to emerging economies so that they can better manage risks that we may have understood in the developed world some years ago, so that we can make sure that we're doing a due diligence approach as risks emerge and, unfortunately, as risks are transferred to other parts of the world. I mentioned our Discovering Safety programme as one vehicle that will add to that data source. And I will end just by saying that we drew some conclusions at the end of the report, obviously. And essentially what we were saying is that there are a huge number of existing data sources that could be drawn upon, that we need to make sure that we identify the opportunities to continuously improve and refresh those data sources, that we identify effective evidence-based interventions that are fed by the data. If they're not evidence-based, they won't necessarily deliver what we want. Make this available to people so that individuals can make informed decisions about their own lives, and make sure that we've got the right education programs in place to transfer the knowledge to those who need it the most. And maybe an ambition of this should be to be able to make that statement that nobody was harmed in the making of this product or the delivery of this service. And when I sat down and wrote this, and Richard made reference to it yesterday, I thought, well, as HSE, could I say that nobody was harmed in the delivery of our services? And at the moment, I don't think I could, because we have, as many organisations do, people with stress and mental ill health, and therefore we have contributed to their individual conditions. So I think there's something for us to think about there, and maybe if we shared that ambition, it would get that conversation started about how we can genuinely use data to improve the lives of the working world. So I'll finish there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, we've got time for a few questions for Andrew. Who would like to start us off?
It's whatever.
Okay, we'll start with this one. Yep, over here. Thank you.
Hi. I'm just going to repeat what I said in my last question, which is, it's not a joke, really, it's serious. And in terms of safety, in terms of impact on the people using it, I just find it amusing that Microsoft and all these other companies have figured out safety solutions for the tiniest, trivialist things. But when it comes to smart meters, when it comes to all these huge devices, which the companies have invested £10 billion in, so I can understand they want to get their money back, but they shouldn't really be getting their money back at our expense, or even at their own expense, because they also have families and children as well. So in terms of safety, not just for humans or animals, but for the planet as well, what caution is being heeded with regards to this erroneously really very strong 5G? And this is not something that can be isolated to one country or one people. This is every single one of us. Thank you. And just one last thing with regards to the next speaker that's going to speak about the oceans. Last 10 years, we've seen whales and dolphins coming to the surface dead. That's the same thing. The sonar waves from the army ships, dead. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, it's clearly something where, from my perspective as a chief scientific advisor to a government department, I'm driven by the evidence. I don't know the evidence. It's not something I've looked at personally, but I can say that we as HSE have something called a Workplace Health Expert Committee, and they have a watching brief on the issue of 5G and other sort of similarly related issues, and they will be looking at the general topic from the evidence base in probably the next 18 months or so. Now, that probably doesn't give you the answer that you want, but from my perspective, I have to be driven by the evidence, and we will have to wait and see what that looks like when we do that evidence-based review.
Thank you. Yep, over here.
Hi, Neil McCallum here from Lloyd's Register Group. My question was, when you've been involved in reviews like this looking globally, are there particular outstanding examples where industries or countries have done better at predicting, developing predictive capability around risk, and then being able to intervene before disasters occur?
I think probably the best examples I can think of are in the oil and gas industry, where they've collected an awful lot of data. And we've done some work with them in the past, looking to see if we can jointly identify some of those leading indicators. And in fact, I think one of our use cases in the Discovering Safety program is looking at some of those issues and how we might use data to more effectively identify where those issues may occur. The challenge is always collecting enough of the right kind of data in the right way, and that's where the big data comes in, and integrating that with the small data, which is the rare occurrences when something fails. And that's where I think joining together some of these activities between the regulated and the regulator will really help to understand where we might best intervene together.
Andrew, talking about human analytics and wearable tech, how do you think the opportunity for bringing safety to life through that is going to be impacted by regulation like GDPR, which is kind of keeping people safe in another way, but therefore might inhibit this? And where do you think employers will stand on the basis that we want you to do this because it keeps you safe at work versus your own personal security?
It's a really good question, and I think if I look back at some of the other challenges that we've had, one of them was when genetic testing became the vogue thing of the time, and there was a view then that you might be able to genetically test workers so that you could identify those who were better able to tolerate risk or higher exposures. It didn't happen, and it didn't happen because the ethics played into the conversation. In the case of wearable technologies, I think there is a better opportunity to be very clear about the role that the wearable technology will play, and ensuring that, if you like, the contract between the employer and the employee is very clear about what will be collected and how that information will be used. And I think if it's considered in the context of risk management, then the benefits to both parties can be clearly identified. The danger will be that if, as a consequence, people do things that they are not supposed to do and use it as a way of spying on individuals, seeing how long they, spend on the outside having a cigarette or whatever, then that won't work, and it will immediately become a bad thing, and it then become very difficult to implement. So I think right at the start, we have to be very clear what that contract, that emotional contract is, between the employer and the employee.
I think we've got one last question here. I think.
Ranjiv Gunawardhanas, I would like to find out, in relation to all that data that you displayed on the screen, you've got so much data. What are you doing in relation to emerging economies? Because they don't have to go through the same rigmarole as you have gone. You've got the data, you know where the challenges are, and some of these new economies probably might gain valuable insight into how to relieve themselves of certain problems before they actually happen.
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right to identify that it's a different challenge. In that situation, it's more a challenge of communication and making sure that the right evidence is being played into the right conversations with the right people. There are opportunities there, so there are some groups that we can work through, for example. So there's an International Association of Labour Inspectors who we can work with in relation to sharing data. That covers all of those countries of the world where there is a labour inspectorate. There's the International Labour Organization, there's the World Health Authority, and there's also side groups from things like the G20 who also have an interest in this space. So I think for me, it's about identifying the right channels to engage the right people to enable the conversation to be happening and for that information to be appropriately shared. Because you're absolutely right, we have a lot of knowledge and experience and data that would be very helpful in those situations and help technologies to be implemented in a healthy and safe way, which, if that data wasn't made available, might be more of a problem.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks for much.